Bienvenidos, bienvenidos. Buenos días. ¿Qué tal?
Buenos días, señoras y señores, y bienvenidos al evento de lanzamiento Infrascopio de 2021-2022. For those of you who are connected online, we have interpretation into English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So please select your language of preference. Just go down to the globe icon on the lower right-hand corner of your screen.
English and Portuguese. Please select the language of your choice in the world icon below. For those connected to the event via our social media platforms, please look out for the links we will post in the chat to connect to the different languages. Mauricio Claver-Carone, President of the Inter-American Development Bank, will be giving the opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good morning to everyone here, and good morning to everyone across the IDB's 26 bar member countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Really excited about today's event, as it's going to showcase our partnership with Economist Impact, and thank you for that partnership. And in this new edition of Infrascope report, it's all going to include every one of the IDB's countries in the region. So we're excited about that. I think this work represents an important contribution to understanding our region's ability to really implement sustainable and efficient public-private partnerships in critical infrastructure sectors. And what better time to do so than during the critical needs today. We all know that rankings catch the attention of many people around the world, and we also know the potential positive impact that placement in rankings could have for any country. And that's why we thought that it's going to be particularly important to highlight the numerous opportunities across the region where there are really enabling environments for infrastructure PPPs, such as what we're seeing in Brazil, in Chile, and to the emerging environments like we're seeing in Guatemala, Jamaica. We want also nascent environments that would benefit from early investments. And let me highlight that for the first time, the Infrascope now also assesses the environment in countries for enabling social infrastructure PPPs like hospitals, schools, and we all know that addressing those gaps in health and education are going to be critical this year and beyond. Now, as we consider these rankings, I think it's important that we focus on the usefulness of this tool as an objective measure of both the progress our countries have achieved and what we all still need to achieve to overcome the challenges to public-private sector participation in infrastructure projects. As we're going to explore in depth today, further progress is going to depend on targeted action in the areas of regulations and institutional strengthening, project preparation, sustainability, financing considerations, transparent, consistent risk management and monitoring of contracts, and of course, performance evaluation. With a more comprehensive methodology and updated indicators, this year's analysis can truly help us set really the guideposts on the path to achieving more sustainable, efficient, and bankable PPPs. And by the way, what better time to do so than now, and particularly as we're coming out of this COVID crisis, which at the end of the day, we have a pathway towards because of, as I've said before, and I repeat, the most impressive and significant public-private partnership in the history and modern history, which was obviously the vaccines that got us to where we are today. So the power to jumpstart the recovery and broad economic growth that all our countries are looking for, and that's what we here at the IDB are working every day to realize. Indeed, every dollar invested in infrastructure and the management of its assets adds about $2 to GDP. PPPs encourage higher investment levels with better quality and are key for the faster adoption of new technologies. Investing in large-scale sustainable infrastructure projects can have a transformative impact on sectors and in services, while also tending to be more attractive to multilateral and private investments, and of course, providing many jobs during the construction and operation. So it's like win, 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 and win. Building resilient infrastructure amid the worsening impacts of climate change is also going to be key. Every dollar invested in resiliency means $4 that's saved in rehabilitation and reconstruction. So it's a no-brainer, and I think we all need to work together to make it happen. Today, our region's considerable effort to improve the quality of and access to infrastructure services stacks up against a really tough reality that we face every day. Latin America and the Caribbean needs to invest an annual $2.2 trillion. That's more than 3% of its GDP in water and sanitation, energy, transportation, and of course, telecommunications infrastructure. And that's just to be able to meet the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Clearly, Closing the infrastructure gap is going to require the financing as well as the efficiency and innovation that the private sector brings. Billions of dollars are out there for these projects. Of course, not enough to get to the trillions, but billions. So we gotta keep hustling at it. And as the Infrascope presents guideposts of how we attract it, that's why we're here today. Because without the private sector, we've said it now, we've said it multiple times, we are billion-dollar institutions looking to meet trillion-dollar needs. And without the private sector, we're just not going to do so. So we need to be able to mobilize, we need to be able to do so, and public-private partnerships are going to be key to do so. And we need to work together with both public and private sector at each step. The good news is that we're doing more than ever before in this realm. The IDB's new value proposition vaults our bank into the 21st century. That has been our goal. We're creating an integrated continuum of innovative public and private support through the IDB and, of course, our private sector arm, IDB Invest. Let me give you a great example. The PPP single window. That's our one-stop PPP shop with IDB and IDB Invest working together in tandem to provide critical downstream and upstream technical assistance to make these projects a reality. To date, our PPP single window has responded to demands for preparation in 30 infrastructure assets and services. We've seen it in transportation, health, energy, education, water, and sanitation. And these projects have the potential to generate over $7.5 billion in investments. So we're off to a good start, but there's a lot more to do. And of course, this is supplemented by our investment-driven knowledge generation and matchmaking. And the matchmaking is key, and that's why we also created the largest private sector coalition in the history of the bank. And from this Infrascope report to our region-wide PPP network to our marquee PPP Americas event, which next year is going to be in Panama, Latin America's top public-private partnerships forum, we're full steam ahead. By definition, PPPs are a collaborative effort, and the result is greater than the sum of its parts. So we are able to co-finance and mobilize resources for PPP development from remarkable international partners from the UK. We've done so European Commission, Japan, Korea, Spain. We've also leveraged resources for joint project preparation facilities with key partners in the region like Brazil, Colombia, and Jamaica. And during the Brazil Investment Forum just a couple of weeks ago, we unveiled the LATAM Projects Hub, which is a platform that provides strategic information about concessions and public-private partnerships across the region. So as you can see, we here at the IDB continue to work to improve enabling environments with the use of the Infrascope, including in Brazil, where we support PPP projects that will replace 100% of the public lighting systems in several municipalities, which we're excited about. That's just one of these projects, and I like this one because it's one of several pilots for what we call the FAST Infra Sustainable Infrastructure label, which is designed, in this case, to enable project sponsors, developers, and owners to signal the positive sustainability impact of infrastructure assets, and of course, which is the goal, to attract investors seeking ESG investments. By the way, let me stop here real quick. Like the $25 trillion in institutional investors' assets looking for ESG investments. If we just attracted 10% of that for Latin America and the Caribbean, think about it, $2.5 trillion. That's like the GDP of Japan almost. The transformative impact that would have for the region. So everything we can do to attract those investments are going to be key. Let me give you an example. In Peru, we're currently working with ProInversión, which is the country's private investment promotion agency, and we're going to hear more about that later this morning. I know the executive director, Rafael Ugas, is going to participate in the panel. We look forward to hearing that. So, and what we're doing there in Peru is what we learned is that successful wastewater treatment PPP in the Amazon region of the country, and what we're replicating it now in 6 major cities and benefiting 2.5 million inhabitants. So I think that's incredible. That's what we need to be replicating, and that's what we need to be, frankly, at the vanguard of across international financial institutions. So let me once again thank everyone who's participating in today's event. Our partners at Economist Impact, thank you. Our public sector and private sector leaders, thank you. All of our audience. And I think this report is going to help us find and also assemble the crucial missing pieces of the PPP puzzle, because there's still missing pieces. And the more that we get it right, our work together is going to be able to revitalize sectors, to boost economies, generate jobs, improve services, and obviously help the people of this opportunity-filled region, which is ultimately our goal, improving their lives. So thank you very much. Appreciate all your support.
Thank you, Mauricio. Now, I would like to introduce Vaibhav Sahgal, Principal for the Americas at Economist Impact, who will be presenting the main findings of the Infrascope 2021-2022. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here and participate or present our key findings at this Infrascope launch event. Economist Impact and the IDB have been working together on the Infrascope program since 2009. And we are very happy to continue this partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank in the 7th edition of the Latin America and the Caribbean Infrascope. This is the 2021-22 Infrascope, and the focus of our tool, of our benchmark, is to measure the strength and effectiveness of enabling environments for public-private partnerships in Latin America and the Caribbean. So without further ado, let me get into it and start talking about the structure of this presentation, followed by our key findings. My presentation is going to have 4 main sections. I promise I'm going to try to keep it as quick as possible. Start with a quick introduction, discuss the theory of change, some notes on the history of the Infrascope, and the highlights of the 2021 methodology refresh. I'll then go into the key findings, the cross-cutting key findings across the region, and then move to the 5 levels of category findings, including across regulations and institutions, project preparation and sustainability, financing, risk management and contract monitoring, and finally, performance evaluation and impact measurements ex post. I'll finally end this presentation with a recap. So moving to the theory of change, I think there are very few questions on why infrastructure is important, but to very quickly level set there, good quality, high quality, easily accessible infrastructure has huge implications for the population's health, well-being. It greatly matters to sustainable development, and it is also associated with a number of economic development or progress measures across, say, GDP, employment, productivity, number of so on and so forth. The challenge here is that there is a lot of increasing environmental and demographic pressure, not only in the Latin America and Caribbean region, but across most developing and even developed countries in the world. So we really need to start rethinking how utilities, services, infrastructure assets are provided and delivered to populations across countries in the region, but also more broadly. So the question is really, what role does infrastructure play? And it is this question and a range of others linked to bringing more private participation into infrastructure development across the region that the Infrascope is attempting to offer guidance around. There is a huge infrastructure financing gap in the region, as just mentioned by Mauricio, and it is crucial to increase country ability across the Latin America and Caribbean region to attract more private investment, to start narrowing and eventually close this infrastructure financing gap, driving all the efficiency, innovation, economic, social, etc. gains. Moving on, we don't need to look, I'm not going to read out every element of what's on this slide, but here's a quick snapshot of the history of the Infrascope. We started out in year 2009. This is a fairly long-running index program. It was in 2009 that the IDB and Economist Impact, formerly the Economist Intelligence Unit, worked together to set up the first edition of the Latin America and the Caribbean Infrascope. Since then, we've had many editions across different regions with a wide variety of sponsors of the Infrascope globally, with a few checkpoints. One in 2012, when we updated the methodology a few years after the first methodology went live, and another in 2016, which was almost about 5 years from that previous edition. We recently updated the Infrascope methodology, again, 5 years since the previous update in year 2021, to basically reflect the progress that has been made by countries across the Latin America and Caribbean region, but also across a wide variety of other developing countries in the world. We made a number of structural changes as well. I will walk through that in just a minute. Our sponsors, or clients, so to say, that commission the Infrascope globally include the Inter-American Development Bank, of course, the EBRD, the African Development Bank, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Asian Development Bank, the PPIAF, and the World Bank Group. Moving on, just a few quick highlights on what the 2021 methodology refresh was all about. So on the methodology refresh, we worked together with the Inter-American Development Bank's team. A lot of valuable guidance was offered, and we jointly updated the Infrascope methodology, Economist Impact, and the Inter-American Development Bank. But once the methodology was updated, the Economist Impact team had full responsibility to independently gather country data across the 26 countries in scope, put it together, build the rankings, build the scores, do the country research, run the interviews, and come up with the final results of the Infrascope. The overall process included about 80 interviews with domain experts in public-private partnerships and infrastructure, and with a range of country experts across the 26 member countries of the IDB, all within scope for this study. It is a fairly large index measure, which means there are more potential avenues for progress, more measurements available. This index includes 5 key categories, as you can see on the graphic: regulations and institutions, project preparation and sustainability, financing, risk management and contract monitoring, and finally performance evaluation and impact measurement ex post. The index contains 56 main indicators of assessment. The little boxes on the right try to visually depict that, and there are also 106 sub-indicators, both qualitative, quantitative, policy-based, data-oriented input-output measures. So a range of different measures included. Most important to say, the key highlights of this methodology refresh for the Infrascope index. 5 countries were added. We were previously looking at 21 countries in the Latin America and Caribbean region. Now we're looking at all 26 IDB member countries in the benchmark. We have added a new sector to the existing sector scope for the Infrascope. This is social infrastructure, focused on education and healthcare. We have restructured the framework, as you'll see on the right, to more closely map, almost sequentially, the process of developing and implementing efficient and sustainable public-private partnerships in infrastructure. Finally, we have really dialed up the focus on elements of environmental and social sustainability in this framework, and added in a range of updated, more granular data sources from sources, for example, IJ Global, that are actually putting out a lot of relevant data, which we may not have been looking at in previous editions of the Infrascope. So we think this is a huge milestone for Economist Impact, for our sponsors, including the Inter-American Development Bank, and we're very excited to present to you the key findings from the 2021-22 Latin America and the Caribbean Infrascope. 5 key findings, very cross-cutting, relevant at the regional level. I want to start with the positives. A huge amount of progress has been made over the past many years in the Latin America and Caribbean region when looking at the regulations and institutions, the foundations that support the development and the implementation of infrastructure PPPs in the region. But that said, now that the bedrock has been strengthened and fortified, it is time for governments across these countries to start focusing on improvements across the other pillars, including, for example, project preparation, financing, risk management, impact measurement, so on and so forth. So fundamental best practice concepts, namely guidelines, frameworks, in coordination mechanisms, are being codified, are available widely across the region, as I've already suggested. A significant amount of institutional capacity, regulatory capacity is also in place. Now further investments and efforts are required across the region, making these concepts and frameworks on the ground realities. The focus needs to turn towards investing in stronger implementation and enforcement across the board, really. A huge gap across Latin America and Caribbean region, as it is across most other developing regions in the world, to be honest, is very limited focus, very limited kind of documented, published focus even on sustainability, may it be environmental sustainability or social sustainability. This particular thinking has been dialed up in the new Infrascope methodology, and a number of critical gaps were identified, and a number of actionable measures for improvements across this area were also identified here. I will get into those shortly. Leveraging diverse sources of finance across the region, implementing kind of risk identification, risk allocation, even risk measurement frameworks were found to be the strongest overall predictors of our Infrascope scores, which means this is something that countries should certainly be targeting, but it also means that it could almost be seen as an outcome of the efforts in the more foundational pillars and categories and indicators of the Infrascope. The last key finding is really, we noticed a lot of counterintuitive results across this index. And the thing to state here is that data-driven decision-making, evidence-based decision-making is really crucial for countries across the region. We found that policies often actually overlook a number of contextual factors that would actually really help support and bolster the PPP agenda across countries. One very simple example is for countries that have particularly heightened macroeconomic risk. I think there's a scatter plot about this later, but it's definitely in the report. So countries that have heightened macroeconomic risk were actually found not to be implementing adequate risk identification and allocation measures, which is fairly surprising because you could almost see it as being more important for those countries. So that's just one example here. But moving on, I'm going to spend a couple minutes on our country level findings. We have three headline categories across which the country rankings were structured, namely developed, emerging, and nascent. On developed, we have leaders sitting between the 70 to 80 out of 100 scores on the index. They are Brazil and Chile. Here we noticed very strong institutions, a significant amount of experience delivering infrastructure, public-private partnerships, and a proven, well-tested ability to attract domestic foreign capital in infrastructure. We then have the developed high performers sitting between the 60 to 70 out of 100 scoring range. Quite a number of countries here: Uruguay, Colombia, Peru, Panama, and Costa Rica. So these are productive PPP markets, and in many cases, they have enacted new public-private partnership legislation, offered some kind of targeted financial support and assistance for PPPs, but there is a significant amount of room for effort, room for improvement across the categories other than regulations and institutions, where the performance is actually quite strong. Then moving to emerging growth markets, between 50 to 60 out of 100 on the index. We've got El Salvador, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, Mexico, Jamaica, Honduras, and Paraguay. Here, I guess our key finding was a lack of overall consistency. There are impressive scores in some areas, but it shows that in many cases, in many of these countries across the board, there are a lot of gaps around PPP capacity and significant efforts there. Moving to emerging mid-tier, between 30 to 50, we've got Ecuador, Argentina, Nicaragua, Guyana, and Bahamas. They have had some experience implementing infrastructure PPPs, but are still exhibiting many traits of the less developed PPP markets in the region and globally as compared to other developing countries. Finally, we've got the nascent category, which is scores between 0 to 30 out of 100. Number of countries here, in fact, all the 5 newly added countries in the Infrascope fall under the nascent category. They're Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago, Bolivia, Belize, Barbados, Venezuela, and Suriname. They have very limited, often often kind of non-existent experience with delivering and implementing public-private partnerships, and the whole private participation and infrastructure mechanism across these countries is poorly defined, needs a lot of work here. So moving on to category findings here. Across categories, very strong performance on regulations and institutions, about 66.5 out of 100 points. The next strongest performance, again, with very significant gaps, of course, was on financing, which is about 53.5 out of 100. We found this to be a surprising finding, especially owing to macroeconomic volatility and challenges across this region. We noticed huge room for improvement across the other three categories, including risk management and contract monitoring, project preparation and sustainability, but especially across the new category number 5, which is performance evaluation and impact measurement. We think this is incredibly important because that category tries to measure the extent to which countries are learning from their experiences with ongoing operational infrastructure PPPs, and using that to inform, well, gathering data, leveraging that data to inform their overall PPP development agenda. Moving on to regulations and institutions, the average is very high. A lot of progress been made in this area. We've got 4 main kind of evaluation areas here, including conducive regulatory environment and political will or political support around public-private partnerships. The PPP dedicated agencies, starting right at, do they exist, going all the way to, do they have the right capacity, technical, legal, financial, so on and so forth. So this is crucial from an institutional support angle. Then moving on to the competitiveness and openness of the bidding process. Again, extremely important when it comes to selecting PPPs, evaluating PPPs, accepting bids, and installing confidence across private participants, potential private participants. And then finally, we're looking at contract variations, specifically the fairness and openness of contract changes. Fairly steady, stellar performance across all 4 evaluation areas here, a high regional average, as I already mentioned as well. At the risk of repeating what I've been saying previously, regulations and institutions are the most effective foundation around which successes in later categories are built. These need to be in place and are in place across the Latin America and Caribbean region. It is now time for governments to turn their attention towards progress on other areas, the 4 other areas of the Infrascope, where more obvious gaps and more obvious and significant gaps exist that need a lot of work. Moving on, project preparation and sustainability. The regional average is a lot lower than the regulations and institutions category. It's about 41 out of 100. You see significant weaknesses across 2 areas here: project preparation and support, and environmental and social sustainability. Between about 28 or 30 out of 100, which means there are huge gaps in both of these areas. Slightly stronger performances across project selection and also the efficiency of the project preparation process. But it is extremely important to say that this is a gap that needs a lot of work, and the Infrascope offers a range of measures that allow countries to assess their current performance and make the required improvements across these areas. We noticed a very strong relationship actually between the efficiency of the project preparation process across countries in the Infrascope, all 26 of them, to the structure and the diversity of sources of financing that countries have access to. Again, this kind of lends credibility to the sequential logic, if you think about it. Once, if you are preparing projects, better projects in a strong manner, your next step is, raising financing, bringing in the private sector participation, and reaching your financial close. So when projects are prepared better, good projects, bankable projects, higher quality projects with more predictable cash flows, for example, they are more successful at attracting stable financing from a range of different sources. The key components of the efficiency of project preparation here include the conversion rate, so preparation through financial close in each country, the level of concentration or really competitiveness across the industry, and finally land administration, the land administration process and an agenda in each of the countries. Moving on to financing, a significantly higher average across the region, 53.5 out of 100. This is somewhat surprising given all the macroeconomic volatility and challenges with the COVID-19 pandemic across the past few years. But yet, financing performance is second only to regulations and institutions. We find that most countries in the region are poised to take advantage or support from multilateral development banks, from private sector investors, international lenders, banks, so on and so forth. The key vulnerability is in the macroeconomic environment, the macroeconomic risks across the region. This is something that is very hard to target individually. It's more of an outcome measure, but there is a lot of room for improvement across, say, the structures, sources, diversity of financing, and also in terms of access to affordable capital in the region. A very interesting finding here, the structure and sources of financing subcategory, including capital structure strength, the ability to accept performance-based or milestone-based payments, and the diversity of sources. Are you raising money through project bonds, through sustainable financing, green bonds, through multilateral participation, through institutional investors? That particular subcategory is the strongest single predictor of overall Infrascope scores. Again, this lends credibility to the notion that off-balance sheet project financing mechanisms and long-term capital market depth are crucial towards the PPP agenda across countries in this region and more broadly globally as well. Moving on to risk management and contract monitoring. Again, another key area for improvement. The region scores at about 48 out of 100 on this measure. And there is a lot of inconsistent performance here. The specific weaknesses are in national monitoring, reporting, data gathering, leveraging that data, and on disaster risk management, may it be insurance, contingent liabilities planning, or just explicit needs to incorporate disaster risk into assessments here. Relatively stronger performance across risk allocation, and actually a very significant improvement around lowered risk of unilateral government action. So, there is much lower risk now across the region on some of the key challenges, such as unilateral price revisions from governments or expropriation risk even. So this is a bright spot, certainly, for the region. On risk management and contract monitoring, one of our key findings here was that our indicator of risk identification and allocation is the strongest single indicator predictor of overall Infrascope country scores. In simple terms, on the left, you have countries that do not have either risk identification or risk allocation processes in place. These are scoring lowest on the Infrascope. And then on the far right, you've got countries which have both processes around risk identification and also requirements around, say, creating a risk allocation matrix. And these are scoring highest on the Infrascope. So a comprehensive approach, a comprehensive systematic approach to risk management, going all the way from identification to equitable allocation, is crucial to improving your enabling environment for public-private partnerships in the region. Moving on to our last category of the Infrascope. This is a new category, an extremely important category that tries to measure whether or not countries are learning by evaluating impact, measuring impact of their ongoing operational infrastructure PPPs across sectors. huge weaknesses across the region on this category. The regional average sitting at about 28 out of 100. As you will see on the slide, for a lot of the evaluation areas plotted on that chart, a lot of countries actually scored 0. They failed to score entirely. Very weak performances here on ex post evaluation of PPP projects. So really gathering data on operational infrastructure, to put it simply. Impact on infrastructure quality and outcomes that the infrastructure is actually supporting. Again, a weak area of performance. Slight bright spot here would be maturity and quality, which is actually one of the areas that was in our previous Infrascope framework as well. But I would say that the most important area for development, for improvement here, is the measurement of impact, or really the thinking around measuring impact on environmental and social outcomes. The region scores 7 out of 100 on this evaluation area. There are a range of recommendations available through the Infrascope to make progress here. A number of indicators, again, plotted here. We found that the sustainability indicator around diversity of sources of financing, bringing in sustainable financing, is actually the strongest performing sustainability indicator in this region, coming in at 50 out of 100. But really across the board on other key sustainability-oriented areas of measurement, may it be environmental and social sustainability, or disaster risk-sensitive investments, or impact on environmental and social outcomes across different categories of the index, the performance is far lower than the average across the rest of the indicators, that the gray bar just as a reference point here. And I think it is important to note that 19 out of 26 countries in the region fail to score, are scoring 0 on any aspect of impact on environmental and social outcomes, the indicator 5.4 on the right with a 6.4 score regionally. This includes evaluating PPP performance against climate change goals, against UN Sustainable Development Goals, requiring PPPs to implement elements of future-proofing into design. Finally, this is my last slide, using the same category logic, offering a quick recap. Regulations and institutions, the foundations have been laid. Much progress has been made in this area. It is time to shift focus towards the remaining 4 areas. On project preparation and sustainability, a fair amount of work is needed. There are still significant gaps in national frameworks across the region, looking at evaluation and selection standards and going all the way to environmental and social sustainability. On financing, surprising findings here. We find that the region is well poised to access, to build strong capital structures for projects and access financing from a range of different sources. On risk management and contract monitoring, again, very significant gaps here with regard to ongoing monitoring and reporting for projects, gathering data, leveraging that data, and bringing in things like disaster risk management. Finally, the weakest area of performance, the most work is needed in performance evaluation and ex post impact measurements. Very critical shortcomings here, very low scores across the region, and a range of areas across which improvements can be made to allow countries to learn from their experiences with ongoing operational public-private partnerships. Thank you so much for listening to me for the last 20 minutes or so. And that's the end of my presentation. The Infrascope Hub is now live. There's a QR code on the top left. Please scan that or hit the link and engage with the results of this study on your own terms. That's the end of my presentation. I will now pass the floor to Richard Martinez, the IDB Vice President for Countries, to lead the panel discussion. Now, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vaibhav. I'm going to switch to Spanish. Ahora vamos a conversar con
We will now have a discussion with 4 regional leaders from countries that have had very interesting work in recent years and will be sharing our experiences. We've got Alejandra Botero Barco, the National Planning Director from Colombia. We have Carmen Marin, the Social Cabinet Minister from Paraguay, Luis Elton, the General Manager for Concessions from the Public Works Ministry of Chile, and Rafael Ugas, the Executive Director of Pro Inversión from Peru. And before giving them the floor, I would like to start with 2 thoughts related to the results of the Infrascope on an optimistic note, but of course without losing sight of the fact that we still have work to do. First, I would like to note that in Latin America and the Caribbean, we are working, and the IDB has been instrumental in the process. The region's countries have made great efforts over the last few decades in strengthening the regulatory frameworks and institutional frameworks for PPPs, while at the same time strengthening their capacities to create sound environments that can attract sustainable investment. This is an essential requirement to unlock the potential offered by PPP arrangements to close infrastructure gaps in Latin America and the Caribbean, which are very considerable, as noted by President Mauricio. Secondly, the IDB group is growing along with the region and strengthening its ability to enhance its footprint through our single PPP window. We offer the tools that provide comprehensive support to countries in the LAC region on 3 levels. First, in order to continue to improve the environment by strengthening the regulatory and institutional framework for PPPs. Secondly, through transactional support by preparing and structuring PPP projects that are sustainable and efficient. And thirdly, by generating knowledge and dissemination of best practices. And in this regard, I would, of course, like to thank and congratulate the team and our PPP unit, in particular, Gaston Asticiano, who's the leader, and the whole team who work hand in hand with the region every day, as well as the team that has been closely following up on the preparation of the report. And as I said, precisely in order to identify the best practices, today we are joined by policymakers from 4 countries that have shown important strides in the regulatory progress with regard to PPPs. So I would like to start by thanking you for joining us, and we will kick off with a question. I would like to say that I'd like to hear from all of you in our first round, so as to then move on to the specifics of each country. So I will ask our panelists to make the best possible use of time, since we have a highly motivated audience and a highly interesting panel after us, which will be dealing with the private sector. I would like to start with a question, and I would like to ask each of you to answer it within 3 minutes, considering the indicators and the realities of countries in the region. I would like to hear from you what you think is the critical factor that enables the PPP sector to really take off. So Alejandra, Carmen, Luis, and Rafael, in that order. Alejandra, please.
Bueno, primero que todo, muchísimas gracias, Richard, por esa
First of
introducción.
all, thank you very much, Richard, for the introduction. Warm greetings to all panelists joining us, and of course to all of the audience listening to us. And thanks to President Mauricio Claver-Carone, as well as the whole team at The Economist and Infrascope that have been working on this significant document, which I think will help not only spotlight the structure of PPPs in Latin America, but also highlight the areas where there's room for improvement. Nothing like a ranking so as to be motivated to improve and compare against each other. We think that will be very useful, not just for Colombia, but for the whole region. I would really appreciate it. So the question is about the critical factor, Richard, to get PPPs to mature and take off in the region. I would say it depends very much on the maturity level and the way PPPs have developed in each country. Definitely having a sound regulatory and institutional framework in place is the first and most important step. At least in the Colombian case, we've had over 20 years experience in developing PPPs, also hand in hand with you, and thanks to your help. And we've developed a corpus of best practices, so that's quite nicely organized. But I think now the challenge, the critical factor, as you say, for this to continue to improve is to see how we can diversify financing sources and how we can also strengthen risk allocation management, as well as identification and monitoring efforts. It's very important to seek diversification in terms of financing sources with a focus on sustainability, as highlighted by the report. I think the coming years will help us, and in the Colombian case, we are working with the 5Gs and the significant environmental sustainability, but our idea is to get to 50% of decarbonization and to really be carbon-free by 2050 across all sectors, not just transport. And this will require working with PPPs. There's a critical factor which has to do with refining the institutions or regulations to diversify income on the one hand, and to have a regulatory a normative framework that will enable green financing, not just for infrastructure, but also for all other sectors. Thank you very much, Alejandra. So, Carmen? Good morning, everyone, and warm greetings to all organizers of this event, the authorities and officials present. And I would perhaps address the question also linking back to what was just said in terms of the role to be played going forward by these complementary instruments that governments can offer to finance public infrastructure. And I say this considering the effects of the pandemic that all of our countries have been going through and the attendant economic impact, of course. In this context, more than ever, it becomes important for us to rethink things so as to strengthen the instruments. And I would perhaps note two significant challenges all of our countries face. First, with regard to the gap we face in terms of infrastructure investment, which remains highly significant, and there's also the limited room that governments have, or the limited fiscal space we have, due to the current circumstances that affect us all. And against this backdrop, we must rethink the instruments. Paraguay is also making strides in developing and strengthening public-private partnerships. We have grown a lot in investments in infrastructure in recent years. But if we address the question as to the critical factor for the region, I would focus on one vital matter, which, in addition to strengthening the institutional structure for PPPs, which again, we have made progress, I would focus on medium-term financing. And this approach is closely related to pension funds. I believe these tools require regulatory frameworks that are aligned with the needs our countries have to really give a boost to the alternative financing sources beyond the traditional mechanisms for investing or reducing gaps in infrastructure. When we talk about the investment needs, I think we will all agree that there are certain priority sectors, but I would probably focus on giving a boost to the long-term financing which our countries have.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Let's move on now to Luis and then Rafael. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and greetings to the representatives from all of the countries present. I'd like to, first of all, express my appreciation for the presentations. The IDB president's presentation I thought was very interesting. Well, looking at the critical factors, the first one and the most important one to develop an ecosystem requires a political consensus. When you have political consensus, you right away will see robust regulatory framework developed in countries' legislatures. And so with a robust, I think the robust regulatory framework, I think there you're going to attract those that are most profitable initiatives. If we look at, first of all, the need to develop those most socially rewarding projects. And these projects that are socially rewarding, they need to reflect a consensus with the community. If they're not reflecting the consensus with the community, then I really don't see a successful PPP framework. And these projects, given the magnitude of scales, imagine, for example, a 200 kilometer highway and the impact that it has in small communities. So our minister, Garcia, states that these concession projects need to be usable for not just those members of the community, but all stakeholders. So having seen all of that, it's essential that we also understand that countries need to clearly define and develop these concession measures, and there needs to be continuance and consistency at every level. Investors then will begin to appear, both foreign as well as local investors, and you'll see investment funds, banks, you'll see the PPPs that we were talking about, and looking at the various types of projects, including highway infrastructure, airport, and other sustainable mobility projects, such as streetcars and other mass transit as well. Thank you very much, Rafael. Good morning. And thank you very much for this kind invitation. It's a very interesting discussion that we've been listening to with regards to Infrascope. And I think this has led to many interesting thoughts and reflections. Now, getting back to the question, I believe that it's going to depend a lot on the level of development of frameworks in each country based on our own experience. And I think based on the experience of others who are present, the regulatory framework has made significant progress. The standards, procedures in Peru, for example, I think have reached a point where we we're able to develop very mature projects that are meeting specific milestones within the state. But I also agree with what Luis pointed out about the need for the social and political consensus to be there. I think the expectations are changing constantly. In the past, over the last 20 years with the PPPs, the initial ones were more focused on transportation, communications, energy infrastructures, as well as fossil fuel development. And now we've transitioned into more social programs, also other issues such including healthcare, hospitals, and water management. And so we need to incorporate new factors and that were perhaps as important. We need to focus on sustainability, resilience, and adopt new technologies and adapt to these changes. That on the one hand, we need to look at what areas do we need to focus on, not just technical specification, but the realm and array of services, working with the PPPs in Peru. We need to reinforce the importance of not just being on the sidelines with regards to technology. We need to be focused more also on outcomes. We need to ensure that the private sector be there available to provide the best technical solutions in raising the level of services that we seek as a nation. Then the final point I want to underscore, which I think is essential, in addition to strengthening capacities, we also need to not lose sight of the market forces, getting back to financing and other variables that I think someone has their microphone on. So it's important that we determine where we're moving, and we need to look at the forces that are impacting not just Peru, but other countries. And there are variables at the global level that require reassessing many of our assumptions and processes being implemented so that we can make the necessary adjustments. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rafael. And thank you for this perspective. I think we've come up with some interesting initial concepts. For example, we know that the political consensus, the social consensus is important, involving the community within the projects, infrastructure projects, infrastructure including ports, highways, and also social infrastructure. And then secondly, the financing aspects, the restrictions that we've seen in the countries, in the region, and new instruments where we can leverage in the region. This is going to be critical in order to find the best alternatives. And ultimately, this requires projects that are bankable, that are profitable and available. And this will result in a very successful portfolio of projects. Also, the need to adapt to new changing trends, and the sustainability needs of the markets and the users. I'm going to start with a couple of questions for each panelist, starting with Carmen. Paraguay is an excellent example of a combination of various factors. In fact, we've been working closely with Paraguay in improving the regulatory framework and the structuring of projects. So, Carmen, I'd like to ask, what areas would you identify that need to be complemented in order to continuously strengthen the PPPs in Paraguay? Well, thank you very much for the question. Just to share the Paraguayan experience in terms of the priorities you just identified, let me just set the context. Looking at the priorities that we are giving in infrastructure investments over the last few years, take into account the following. Every study that we have developed in Paraguay shows a gap in terms of infrastructure investments. And we lost her. I think I'm having a connection problem, bandwidth. Yes, we heard there was an interruption there, but I think we can hear you now. Well, I was saying that there's a huge challenge in terms of what the country still needs to bridge that gap in terms of our fiscal margin. Now, in that context, I would just add that, first of all, these critical factors first have a lot to do with the need for strengthening institutions, especially when we're implementing PPPs. There's a series of technical regulatory requirements, also the need for greater transparency. I would just throw these out. I know that this is just a very simple depiction of the bureaucracy and red tape, but I think there's still a lot of gaps there. We still have seen a significant advance. We've seen significant advances, but we need to consolidate these tools. And Paraguay is making efforts in these aspects that have to do with streamlining many of the transactions that are required, as well as streamlining many of the requirements. And at the same time, looking at technical reports for these projects. Another critical point that I think that we are now beginning to see progress in, which relates to strengthening the role of public banking institutions in the financing aspects. This is going to provide a great deal of support in terms of infrastructure, investment in infrastructure. Paraguay has experienced a significant growth where, and we've talked about that 60% gap. The technical studies have shown that the average that requires 2 to 3% of GDP investment, Paraguay is now around that area. We now have an annual investment of about 3.4% of GDP. So this has reflected significant growth levels over the last few years. And it also shows the priority that our country is giving to this. And that's why we are focused, keenly focused in adding even more emphasis and spurring on this to streamlining the requirements, this regulatory requirements and technical requirements, with a special focus on transparency. Throughout the life cycle of PPPs, there are requirements that include publishing documents, that include giving a key role of the comptroller's responsibilities. This political economy that I was talking about, that goes hand in hand with transparency in the project formulation, and also to share the step-by-step monitoring and oversight process and follow-up. Thank you, Carmen. Let's move on now to Rafael. I know Peru is a nation that has invested a great deal, and not just in the traditional infrastructures, but also new infrastructure, including water treatment facilities and other initiatives. We're very proud of having been involved in that. When we looked at Infrascopio, we see that Peru has an environment that is very conducive for creating sustainable PPP. So, Rafael, what do you see as the next steps in terms of the PPP programs in Peru, and how can we continue to contribute to these initiatives from the perspective of multilateral development banks? Well, can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. As we were discussing earlier, we've made a great deal of progress in the last few years with the transportation, communications, infrastructure, upgrades. And now the challenge lies in addressing social infrastructure. And with the support of the IDB has been very valuable in this regard. And not just in these areas, but also in strengthening hospital infrastructure. These are new projects for us. And this includes many valuable lessons learned. And I think it's been very valuable to replicate in other parts of the region. So I think when we talk about the next steps, the next challenge is to really show that the PPP mechanism continues to be an excellent alternative, a very powerful tool for bridging infrastructure gaps. This needs to be done by bringing these projects to market and in a timely way without losing sight of risk assessment, risk management. So we have a fairly robust regulatory framework, as I mentioned earlier. Now we need to prove that we continue to be relevant in closing and bridging these gaps with a certain sense of urgency without impacting on the quality of these measures. This requires the implementation of follow-up and oversight mechanisms. And we need to have these follow-up and monitoring measures. That requires a constant management. And again, this looks at every step in the process. And there are areas where the IDB, I believe, can provide assistance. So strengthening capacities and the skill that the IDB has in addressing many of these requirements. We need to be able to respond quickly, for example, when we have unexpected events. The rapid response by the IDB has been a significant help in helping identify best practices in project management and sharing experiences, as we saw in the case of hospital infrastructure, looking at experiences from other countries in the region that contribute to help with us and it can be implemented here. Another area that I think is very important that can be of great assistance would be to incorporate into our portfolio of projects. We have one portfolio that's very mature, other that is developing and maturing. And I think here we can get a lot of assistance to see exactly what are we overlooking vis-a-vis other countries in the region. Thank you. Well, thank you, Rafael. Let's now move on to Alejandra. We know that Colombia stands out for its institutional and regulatory environment that is very solid. And we've seen many successful experiences working with public and private partnerships, institutions that have developed financial institutions, the national development and planning agencies that show that convergence of wills. And this is a great value that Colombia has added to the table, sharing these experiences and developing infrastructure that has helped to polish and fine-tune many of these agreements. And you have the 4G, the working with the social, the issuance of social bonds with IDB Invest with $135 million. in value. So Alejandra, what can you share with us and with regards to these continuous projects that have become innovative in the region in the area of financing? Thank you very much. And the fact is that this discussion has been very rewarding and interesting for the participants. And I've been just preparing some responses and just listening to the reflections of other countries in the region, I think has been, again, enriching to have that broad-based perspective. As you have so aptly stated, this has been a 20-year development journey to see how we've been able to strengthen PPPs and their role in investments, especially in infrastructure investments. I think the next step, our new horizons, if I can put it that way, is that focus on a more diversified financing. We still have challenges in the area of technical capacities, especially at the regional level. And there's also challenges in developing master sectoral plans that go hand in hand with providing that fifth pillar that has come up in this document, which has to do with the follow-up and oversight of projects. There's some challenges there. And just delving into the diversification and financing aspects, the model that we talked about earlier, that Umichaka, which is one that where we want to continue to develop. In September of last year, Colombia had the first sovereign green bonds issued, and the original was going to be for 500 million pesos. But now it's going to be 2.3 billion in total in pesos. So with a total of 550 billion that was and public bid. So I think there's a lot of appetite for this kind of green financing that goes hand in hand with the development of PPP initiatives, together with other challenges that the countries in the region face to address the very ambitious environmental targets and objectives. So we have the finance component, the green finance component that supports the diversification of sources, but we can't overlook what was discussed here in the panel. You looked at the ethics as well. You were talking about that with the IDB to see not can we only strengthen the green financing, but also work with safeguards in the community. That's another essential area of opportunity that can be further developed. And looking at Colombia in particular, we have a new horizon, which includes all of the efforts in social projects. Peru has a long journey in the area of developing school infrastructure, the educational sector, as well as housing and water and sanitation. Again, we have a lot of space there for improvement and opportunities in strengthening publics and utilities and services, working with PPPs, because the ultimate benefit is going to reach out to all citizens in Colombia and to reach out to all of our communities with an effective array of utilities and services. So I think these are some of the key horizons, with emphasis in green financing, that we also have a lot that we can do with the communities. And also, we're going to be working closely with the IDB and with all the other multilateral banks in best practices. The UK has also provided a lot of support in diversifying the portfolio so that we can emphasize many of these education, healthcare, and other social projects. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alejandra. And now we're going to conclude with Luis. Congratulations. In Chile, according to the Infrascope and the rankings, Chile has come out as one of the most consistent top performers, looking at the economic and social progress. Of course, Chile has among the most rock solid regulatory processes. And looking at, for example, the net value of revenues, and you're also putting a great deal of emphasis on PPPs in the social programs. But just to get back, provide a little more emphasis on what you were saying earlier regarding the political economy of the projects, the political consensus, the social consensus, linking together the communities as a partner in this. What is Chile's experience? What are some of the challenges that you've had to deal with? And what are some of the new horizons that you see before you, so that we can profit from the experiences of Chile here in our discussion? Go ahead, Luis. Well, first of all, that's the same question that we have been asking in the Ministry of Public Works and in the ministry in general, because it's a very daunting challenge. We've overcome the legal framework challenges. We know that this needs to continue to improve over time. We've had many reforms and adjustments in 2010 and on. So it requires more legislative efforts for this to become reality. But this is something a lot of people don't really see. The only ones that really are aware of this are the direct end users. People who live in the country don't really pay much attention in the financial details. And the state, as you mentioned, by incorporating and generating the project financing, the concession flows, and we know that we've looked at infrastructure bonds that, despite the crises and failures of, for example, even so, the concessionaires have lost support and they could not continue to make each one of the payments. And you have the income distribution mechanisms. These are some things that support, as most of you also agree, these are things that support a robust private partnerships and concessions that are sustainable over time. So then the focus and the goal is to be able to clearly communicate our message and to clearly communicate the benefits. We have to first overcome many obstacles. People think that these infrastructures are only to benefit the private sector, and that's not the case. So it's very important that people understand that these are public infrastructure to benefit the public. So we need to clearly define the projects within our country, and that is done by respecting and strictly all of the planning instruments, the regulatory plans. And at the same time, we need to discuss these things with the public. We need to apply the technologies, all the tools that are available. Why not, for example, consult the public to see for example, discuss the projects that are going to be implemented? If, for example, Highway 5, which is a major highway, are we going to include a bypass, or should we just put on a third or fourth lane? These things should be consulted with the public. And I believe that I think we can take that extra step so that we can involve the local authorities, the local legislators, the mayors, as well as community organizations, so that these projects that are so important and such large-scale investments can be, the information about this can be shared. And as the people in the public works state, these are opportunities to improve the daily lives of our communities. If you need, for example, additional lighting projects, we need to look at these approaches. Or for example, we need to take the gender perspective at the airports when we're building new facilities. maybe we can consult the public and get that gender perspective. Maybe we need to have changing stations for women or parents at the airports. So there are many other areas where progress can be made. And I think it's very important that we abide by that. And to do that, we need to, I think, spread the message in countries to establish also new skills for the professionals that are working in these public works departments and offices, because it's not just a question of funding engineering or highway or technology programs and projects. It's not just a question of that. We need to provide a much broader dimension that requires new professional skills. These are the things that need to be added to the mix.
Thank you very much, Luis. It has indeed been a very rich discussion. Thanks to all four panelists, and a few thoughts on the points made. I think at the end of the day, these processes need to be very rigorous from a technical perspective and be supported by sound regulatory frameworks and institutional capacity. But they come up against the reality of day-to-day work with people, and it's about the benefit for people. And one of the takeaways is precisely about the importance of keeping the balance, and therein lies the challenge, so that the projects may be not just sustainable from the financial point of view and even sustainable in environmental terms, but also from the social and political point of view, they must be duly dealt with in order not to come up against hurdles. Another major takeaway, I think, is that we must preserve the balance between the sense of urgency in the region and the quality of projects, as well as the appropriate risk allocation. Also, the safeguards came up, ethnicity, gender issues are also very important. And going back to the first point, it's about attaining sustainability on all project fronts. Then there's financing, considering co-financing and the role of public banks. Clearly, that is a challenge for us going forward. In closing, I would like to thank you. I think that's precisely what we wanted from this panel, highlighting the role of policymakers in order to transfer knowledge to other policymakers who may help bridge the gap and enhance the learning curve. Having said that, I will now give the floor to our Chief of Staff and Chief Strategy Officer, Jessica Bedoya, who will join us for a panel that will be just as fruitful, focusing on the private sector. Good morning. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
Muy bien. Good morning, everybody. I'm very excited to be here. I know that you heard from the president directly. He was very enthusiastic. He's had this report on his radar for a very long time. So we're very happy to be here together and have conversations at a technical level about what the study means and where the region is. Again, I want to say good morning and welcome to our second and final panel of the day. My name is Jessica Bedoya. I'm the Chief of Staff and Chief Strategy Officer at the Inter-American Development Bank. And on behalf of the bank, it's a pleasure to welcome our four participants to this conversation. Now, earlier today, we heard from President Claver-Carone about the usefulness of the Infrascope for Latin America and the Caribbean and for the IDB's own accelerated work to support PPPs. We've learned about the detailed findings from our friends at the Economist Impact, and we have also heard from public sector leaders about how they plan to implement those best practices for PPPs going forward. So now it's time to hear from all of you on this panel, our leaders in the international private sector. How can we mobilize the billions of dollars out there that can help spur recovery and growth in areas ranging from the green energy transition to better trade connectivity to modern schools and modern health systems? And how is the current context for doing so different than in the years past? Today, we will hear the perspectives of the world's biggest money manager via Jose Maria Certuche of BlackRock, a leading global developer of infrastructure projects, from Rodrigo Jimenez Alfaro of Sacyr Concessions, a leading global bank that is helping fund these projects, and from Pablo Pulido of Sumitomo, a global law firm helping enable these projects as well. And finally, Jessica Springsteen of Clifford Chance. So welcome to all of you, and I look forward to the conversation. Now, the IDB's 26 borrowing member countries in Latin America and the Caribbean know that realizing their PPP potential is needed today, now more than ever, in a context of high public debt and extraordinary economic and social infrastructure needs. And as you heard the IDB president describe, we at the IDB are modernizing to step up our own work in support of public-private synergies and mobilization, which we believe will be the primary driver of recovery and growth. And so all of your insights will also help us advance in that mutual goal. Now, we have to cover a lot in a very short period of time. So a couple of ground rules, and I know it might be difficult because a lot of us are passionate about all these issues. We'd like to keep all of our responses for the following questions to 3 minutes if we can. I try to be a decent timekeeper, but I get lost in substance. So I'll leave it to our panelists to keep track of your time so we can be brief and to the point, and also thoughtful in terms of our engagement today. So the first question for all of our panelists, it's really for all of you. As we learned today, the new edition of the Infrascope reports strong performance in the region in the area of regulations and institutions, which is a testament to the hard-earned progress that is something that the IDB has worked on so intensively. But the Infrascope also says that countries must work harder on project preparation, financing, and risk management. You all have deep expertise and experience working in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so what does the evolution of the region's PPP environment look like from your perspectives? What should the order of priorities be today for the region and for the IDB to unlock more PPPs? So for that question, let's start in order, and we'll start first with BlackRock. Jose Maria.
Thank you. First and foremost, let me thank the IDB for the invitation and the panelists for this discussion. I think it's been very interesting to listen to the results of the Infrascope this morning, and we've seen some of the areas highlighted that we think about constantly as we look to finance these projects. I would say, trying to keep the answer short, as we've seen, a lot has been done in the region. Some countries have taken different approaches, but there has been a lot of learning that has taken place. One takeaway that we continuously look at institutionalized third and fourth generations of these types of projects, right? And so, to the extent that continues to happen, it fosters better PPP projects, if you would, and designs. One of the things that we have found, across the region is a need for further development in the capital markets. I would tell you that in some of our countries, it's hard to finance projects in local currency. There isn't necessarily enough participation in the banking sector or from lenders. And so helping foster the development of hedging strategies, deepening the capital markets, and bringing the tools to foster the participation of more international players so that the financing structures can be updated to world-class standards, if you would be significantly helpful. Retaining talent is another issue that we've noticed. As administrations change, having career officers that have worked with these schemes and have the ability to retain that institutional memory is something that also has provided significant advantages, if you would, to the countries that are able to do that. And so in a nutshell, I think, continuing to develop the capital market so that the debt portion of the financing for the projects is present and adequate is something that fosters the ability of private investors. Finally, one note that we've made in a few of the jurisdictions is perhaps working a little bit more in updating the structures throughout the construction period of the projects, so that they are more bankable. In some of the jurisdictions, throughout the construction period, you have sort of an uncovered risk in terms of the early terminations, which makes financing for the construction portion of the project more challenging. And so to the extent that can be addressed, I think that would be helpful in making these projects more feasible and easier to finance, for their full life. And finally, one note that this is something that I think we're all dealing with on the back of the pandemic, and all of the impacts that we've seen in the past year, is having more flexibility, having the ability for these schemes to react, having the flexibility for the public sector to adapt the projects and to absorb some of the impacts and the changes that are being experienced in the market, so that the projects can remain viable for the longer term. But with that, again, thank you, and let's move on to the next one.
No, thank you so much. And actually, there are a few issues that you raised, BlackRock and Jose Maria, that I think touch on exactly the kind of challenges we are also facing at the IDB on our private sector side, and we can touch on those later, in particular the local currency. I think it'd be good to hear from you and from others on how we can be more helpful in that regard. Let me pivot quickly to Cecile and Rodrigo for your thoughts on the initial questions.
Hello to everyone. Thank you for this time. And from my point of view, we are very active in different areas in LATAM, as you know, Chile, Uruguay, Colombia, Paraguay. And we do really believe IDB is playing a very important role, at least to us, And there are two different phases. One is the bid phase, when you're analyzing this project, not only from the perspective if you want to lend money or whatever, it's because you want to structure or you want to help to the grantor to launch this kind of bid. And I think, or we think that is very important to us, because we are going to meet all these ESG requirements, because you have been analyzing the project, and also the economic impact on the society is going to be sure, And we have more than one experience in the past. Even when we were in the bid phase, in the end, the project was not done due to this analysis was not done in a previous stage, by the IDB or by a multilateral. So that is very important. Of course, when we are in the bid phase, if we get this term sheet or we know your interest, your letter of interest for this kind of project, and you can lend money, we feel more comfortable. In these countries where maybe the pocket is not as deep as other countries, it's not the same. If we are in a bid phase in Chile, we have seen in the past that they have a huge experience in this kind of project. Than other project, like for instance in Paraguay, when we were bidding or submitting the bid in Ruta 27, and we had your support, and then we felt more comfortable. That is very important. That is one phase, but the other phase, when we are performing the asset. So when we are performing the asset, I think IDB is supporting the project, not only lending, but also, for instance, with these, let's say, credit enhancement tools you are provided. If we talk again in Ruta 27, you were provided these LCs for the construction risk, not mitigating, just removing all the construction risk. So we were able to issue, I think, the first public bond in the history of Paraguay in Ruta 27, thanks to this credit enhancement was provided by the IDB. You did more or less something very similar in Rumichaca Pasto. I think we have been talking about this financial close just 20 minutes ago. So I think IDB is doing a great job trying to boost the debt capital market, and for these countries where maybe the financial or the local player pocket is not as deep as other countries, and that is our point of view.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Let's turn it quickly over to Pablo from Sumitomo.
Hi, Jessica, and thank you, the Infrascope and IDB, for this invitation. So we have certainly seen the region evolve and become more competitive Some of the countries have developed strong frameworks, and this has allowed us to finance strong infrastructure programs, like, for example, the 4G program in Colombia, where we have successfully financed several projects, and as Rodrigo mentioned. Countries keep seeing the private sector as the main contributor in the development of the infrastructure sector. So we believe that with a good interaction and collaboration with different players, the projects can be developed and be financed. Projects with sound structures, with a proper legal framework, are key for us to participate in the financing of this transaction. It is important also that governments and local entities have also good track record of complying with these obligations so that projects can be bankable as well. We believe multilaterals such as IDB will help the government or local governmental entities to prepare projects to make them bankable. Usually, projects takes time to plan and structure. So we believe multilaterals should work hand in hand with local governments at early stage to plan and structure the projects properly. So I believe government should prioritize its resources and identify those projects that are relevant and bring multilaterals to prepare these projects from scratch all the way to a successful tender process.
Great, thank you. All really salient issues that we can touch on in the follow-on questions as well. And now to Jessica Clifford-Chance.
So I think my question was directly related to like what makes, a project or PPP contract bankable, I think from a sort of our legal perspective. So I will, Jessica, touch on that question if that's okay with you, given that we've already heard from the experts in terms of the, from a commercial perspective. So look, I think, what does a bankable contract mean? We all say it, bankable, and we think we all know what it means, but there isn't really a uniform definition of bankability. I think we can just agree that it generally means that there's a solid financial, economic, and technical plan with a risk allocation scheme appropriate for the nature of the project. That there's suitable risk sharing based on the capacities of the country, the state, the concessionary companies, users, financiers, and insurers. And I think, that's generally what we consider bankable. In terms of concrete steps, what are the concrete steps that we can take in terms of making sure that bankable contracts are put out into the market? I think one of the key things is making sure that the country and the PPP unit go out and get soundings from the market to comment on the contracts prior to them being launched. I think that's incredibly important. It's better to spend, I think, 3 or 4 months or however long it takes sounding the key players in the market, financial investors, financial institutions, law firms, accounting firms, all of those entities to see if they can identify the main bankability issues. And oftentimes there are issues that are addressed that help make the contract more robust and bankable. Examples that we've already heard, Colombia and the 4G and 5Gs and concessions and Uruguay's PPAs, for example. Some of the issues that arise for bankability and the investment bankers and the commercial teams can point to them, but it really is looking at the health of the project structure, the commercial plan, the forecast revenue stream to ensure that you are able to attract investors to develop the project and for financiers to provide financing, that there's a matching between the liquidity that's in the market and who is providing the liquidity. Is it pension funds or is it commercial banks? And trying to ensure that there's synergies between the liquidity and the actual project or program that the country is trying to promote. Taking a look at the elements of the financial structure, such as debt service coverage ratios, debt to equity ratios, financial flexibility of the PPP project is extremely important. Termination provisions, as we all know and love. The interplay among the networks of the contracts with the SPV, concession agreement, the EPC contract, O&Ms, direct agreements, those are all very important to, especially financiers when it comes to their credit committees. I would also say it's important to involve all the relevant stakeholders at the very beginning, including all levels of government, the communities, to ensure proper social engagement. This has now been seen as a credit risk if not actually done properly. So, social consultations are incredibly important ahead of the game before having the PPP contract launching it into the market. All actors of the government, at each level should be involved when having these discussions. It's tricky when, ideas are exchanged with the granting authority, for example, but the Ministry of Finance or the representative of the Ministry of Finance is not present to weigh in on the proposed PPP contract. We would say that's something that's really important. And just having a roundtable with market participants has resulted in huge successes. As for example, in Argentina with the PPAs and the roads. So in any case, that's what I would say. I said this exercise is really important, and I think it's been proven that it's been helpful and successful in many of the countries that we've discussed so far.
Thank you so much. And I think your insights are really important in terms of rounding out, what are those best practices and what the region needs to pay attention to in order to improve upon or build upon those structures that allow for a greater legality to the contracts, which address a lot of the concerns over processes and the uncertainties around the processes when you're talking about contracts and you're talking about bids and bringing in legitimate, transparent businesses who want to do real business in these countries. So thank you so much for that insight. Now we're going to pivot a little bit quickly to more specific deep dive questions for each of our panelists. And I thank you again for setting the scene for what I think will be a really great conversation. The first question is for BlackRock, for Jose Maria. BlackRock has $10 trillion in assets under management. So you know about global investing. And increasingly, sustainable investing and impact investing are priorities for you. The Infrascope finds that few countries place adequate weight on developing environmentally and socially sustainable PPPs. So, what needs to happen in the region to increase the use of an appetite for sustainable investment products? What are those opportunities, and how can we as an institution at the IDB work better with you to ensure that we're strengthening the public sector and their interest in pursuing these types of projects?
If we only had a magic wand, right?
Absent a magic wand.
Yeah. Look, I think to a large extent, responsible investors will understand that environmental, social, and governance risks are investment risks. And for our projects to be successful, we need to take all these issues into account. Every stakeholder for a project needs to be taken into account from the get-go, like Jessica was just mentioning, right? From social consultation all the way up to environmental impact and so forth. In our experience, we've learned the hard way, I should say, I guess, that unless you take these risks into account from day one, you really are putting yourself out there for unforeseen outcomes. And so our take is to be very mindful of these issues in our investment process. What we have done is incorporated very, very explicitly and very purposefully into our investment decision process and criteria, so that we can make sure that we've considered all these issues and that they are truly embedded in how we invest and then how we asset manage, right? Because most of these risks do not go away the moment you open a project and start operating. They remain with you. And so ensuring a successful operation that is mindful of every single issue is very important. And the asset management, oftentimes gets relegated, but the reality is that's where the impact is felt. In terms of how the IDB can help, I think there's a lot being done in terms of raising the profile of the issues. I do think to the extent that we can further standardize the criteria of how we look at these different issues, what social consultation actually means. There's very different definitions in every jurisdiction. Even the Inter-American Court has a different approach to it. And so having a common language and a common definition and process, if you would, as to how these topics are approached I think can be very helpful. Focusing on reporting transparency so that projects are in fact reporting on these issues in terms of their compliance and ongoing maintenance of different topics is also very helpful. Creating standards so that investors, financiers, lenders can monitor the compliance and frankly steer their resources into where these risks will be better taken into account. Right? In the end, it's not just about doing good, which is very important, but it's also about making sure that the outcomes are appropriate for our investors. And we are convinced that the better outcomes will come from the projects that better take into account every stakeholder and that really produce robust, sustainable projects down the road. It's an everyday work, and I think the IDB and other agencies are continuously working on this, and we're more than happy to put our contribution to that and work with you guys and sharing what we've done, how we've incorporated these things into a processes, and hopefully continue to improve as we go.
Thank you so much, and I agree. And there's a lot more work that we at the institution need to also do because the environments are changing, and it's a very fluid and dynamic environment every day, and every country is very different and very specific. And so I think what we are doing by having this conversation, in addition to all of the collaboration we've had through co-financing and investment in the region, is being able to chart the course, if you will, for governments to see what good work can produce and what those outcomes eventually look like. And especially on these issues in terms of sustainability, I think that more and more as an institution, we are becoming more aware of the responsibility that we have to be the broker of those conversations, to bring the stakeholders around the table and to help investors feel that extra drop of confidence in terms of engagement with those governments where it might be a little more difficult. Because I think through the projects in Paraguay that we've seen, and in Colombia and in other countries, there are success stories to be had and a lot more to be had, which is the purpose of today and of the study. So thank you. Now turning to Rodrigo from CECIR, I have a related question. CECIR Concessions is a world leader in infrastructure development that is growing in its social infrastructure portfolio. So earlier this year, IDB Invest was proud to be an anchor investor in the largest infrastructure social bond in Latin America and the Caribbean, a CECIR project in Colombia. So tell us about your experience investing in social sustainability. What should our countries do to tap into private sector resources to help meet this tremendous need today?
Okay, so as you have said, we have been the first to issue a social bond in the area. In this case, was Puerta de Hierro, and we have issued the biggest social bond in the area in Colombia. And this time is Rubichaca Pastor, as you say. Okay. First of all, what we want to say is, in our case, these environmental and social issues is inside our strategy. Okay, we want to be a profitable company, of course, but the only way we think we can be a profitable company in the long term is if we respect this kind of aspect. Okay, we don't want to be in a world where we are going to be concerned just pricing. But we have to pay more attention to this aspect. Okay, we have to meet the ESG requirement because we want to live in a better place. Actually, we have done in the past, even if we didn't know we were doing. Okay, so we feel very proud about it. Just now, I think there are a lot of opportunities to invest in this sustainable financing. For instance, all the refinancings of the 4G program in Colombia, I think, or at least our project, we can be labeled as social bonds, so we can invest in this kind of project. Just today, we have submitted a bid in Colombia, it's Canal del Dique. We do really believe that is going to be labeled as a green project, so you can invest in this project also. So we feel very proud to invest in these areas, in these countries, which they pay attention on this requirement, okay? Because we don't want to invest only just because we are the cheapest. That is not our strategy. We want to add value to the chain. We want to add value to the areas, to the society, and to the country. And we do really believe that is the only way to be profitable in a long term. And of course, we want to live in a better place where our kids, our children can live in a better way than what we are living today. Okay, so that is what we are doing.
Okay, thank you so much. And we welcome both the pipeline so we can jointly go into projects together and the continued collaboration and your insights today. Now turning to Pablo from Sumitomo. Sumitomo has an important presence in the Americas and a focus on infrastructure development and renewables. In Chile, for example, your bank is hard at work developing various infrastructure-related businesses in electricity, water, and transportation. I want to ask you about risk management, an area that the Infrascope has identified where there is inconsistency in the performance of most of our countries. How important is risk management policy, sound contractual structures, which Jessica raised earlier, and reliable local partners to make PPPs and especially sustainable infrastructure PPPs successful?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Yeah, I think the points that you mentioned, are key for a successful development of a project. We as bankers rely on these factors to finance these projects. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. A project with a sound contractor structure and proper lead risk allocation, for example, in terms of, let's say, rights of way, who is going to manage the process, who is assuming the economic risk, a proper allocation of risk in terms of construction, licenses, permits, etc. Will allow us to better identify the risk and better price these risks. When we price this risk correctly, this risk all the parties associated with the project will benefit, including the government, affected in competitive tender, very competitive tender processes. And as I stated initially, I think multilaterals could play a key role in working with these local partners, like government entities, to develop or prepare projects in sectors that are key in Latin America, like, for example, the water treatment, water desalination, railways, and so on. And I mentioned water because we're seeing the need of investments in this sector in countries like Mexico, Peru, and Chile, to name a few. Multilaterals then can work hand in hand with local governments at an early stage of a project to help structure the projects in terms of legal frameworks, risk management, and so on, including all the way through the bidding process. This will guarantee the proper execution of the project on a timely and efficient manner. So I think the role of the multilaterals is very relevant for development of these infrastructure projects where, the government has not enough resources to do so, and they can count with the multilaterals to partner and develop this infrastructure.
Great, thank you for your inputs. And now turning it back to Jessica, I know that you touched on the essentials for contracting to ensure that the stakeholders are at the table having a conversation, that they're structured in a way that allows for full transparency and for the inclusion of clauses that are clear to dissipate the uncertainty surrounding a lot of the PPP structures that we're talking about in the region. So I just wanted to get a sense from you in terms of the standardization of those clauses. What are those barriers and how feasible is it to think about a region and countries that are very different in terms of those environments in which you're trying to design a PPP that could get to a point of standardization of certain clauses that could convey that confidence that financiers and investors are looking for?
Thank you, Jessica. No, absolutely agree. I think standardization is key, especially with respect to large, complex infrastructure projects in any country are going to be hugely time consuming and costly for the countries to prepare and bring to market. That's the reality. And, it's particularly pronounced, I think, in an emerging market like Latin America, where, public funds and capacity are more restrained than other places. So the standardization of PPP contracts not only reassures investors with regard to due diligence, but also increases efficiency of project preparation and market delivery for those governments. In addition to standardized contracts, it enables, I think the type of financing to be packaged a little bit more easily. I think, we've seen in the past that sometimes the projects that are putting out, some of these projects aren't so large. And so I think for larger institutional investors or institutional investors that have a lot more money, it's harder to invest in them if they're not package. So having sort of a standardization of contracts that would address that sort of asset class would be super helpful. So as I mentioned, efficiency, project preparation, but also, increases the overall ticket side of infrastructure transactions, which is, making them commercially attractive to private investments. I think recently the question that we've been getting often is, can you actually include ESG considerations throughout the contract itself, and what would those be, and what would be the consequence? I think, that is the case. I think that those types of provisions will need to be in the actual PPP contracts, and they'll need to be standardized and, reflect what the current performance indicators would be. I think, investors and lenders and financiers have their own internal credit processes that need to show back back to back in terms of ESG. So I think that's, and same with, corporate governance, not just the E, but the S and the G. I think we often forget the social and the governance part, which is very important. So standardization, reduces transaction costs, and it also reduces the potential for, corruption when awarding projects. I think once a contract has been standardized, the market and sponsors understand that there's very little room to negotiate any changes on an individual contract basis. So I think that's very important in terms of maintaining the integrity of what the PPP contract is trying to do. Colombia, as we all know, has a standardized concession agreement, and there have been 0 canceled projects because, the contracts are, standardized to a degree and bankable because of that. So, Peru, unfortunately, they've tried to standardize their PPP contracts, and hasn't been as successful. But I think, the lessons learned from that exercise has been really important. So I think, all in all, standardization is it levels the playing field and allows for predictability and efficiency, both on the government side, as well as the investors and the financiers of a project.
Thank you, Jessica. And I think that's really important. And I think your final words on leveling the playing field is an across the board message that I think we have certainly internalized at the IDB as a development institution in our private sector entities, IDB Invest and IDB Lab. And certainly in hearing from all of you through these conversations and others that we've had in terms of business development, that the point of the study, of the Infrascope study, is in part to inform how we can better level the playing field so that all of us can play our part and be sitting at that table to make decisions with the governments and private sector jointly to help get to some outcomes that are positive and sustainable for the region. So I want to thank all of you again for all of your valuable input in this really, really interesting dialogue. I'm sure that we'll continue it going forward. I think that more important for us today as we close is to talk about collaboration and expanding those opportunities that come from the solid public-private partnerships that support economic growth in Latin America and the Caribbean with a positive impact for the millions of people that live in our region. And I think that as we close, I want to again thank all of you here who are in person at the bank, all of you, the panelists, for joining us today. And I'm going to transition very quickly now to our Vice President for Sectors, Benigno Lopez, for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias, Jessica. Realmente es un gusto.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning, Jessica. It is a pleasure to be here looking at the key role of PPPs, as the president has mentioned, and many of the colleagues talk about the very relevant role of Vision 2025 in this, to mobilize private capital. It's only in this way that we'll be able to bridge the major gap in infrastructure. We need to, in the region, to increase our contributions by 70% in order to achieve our sustainable development goals. We need to build new roads. We have enormous social infrastructure needs as well, including hospital infrastructure. The needs are so great that they're not going to be addressed only by the public sector. The recent experiences in Chile have shown excellent results. As our Chilean colleague already related, they have developed broad-based programs with enormous gains in efficiency in the development and operations of hospitals. They have a portfolio that responds to 25% of the need for hospital beds in the region, in the country. As the president of IDB stated, I'm also very pleased looking at many of the advances in the regulatory framework. In 2009, only one country had an efficient infrastructure for PPPs. Now they're plentiful. So we need that this serve as a sound basis for strengthening public-private partnerships that are improved and better poised. We've seen how the identification of these infrastructure initiatives are the key predictors for strengthening the future path. So I encourage all of you to not only to look more into risk identification and allocation, but also strengthening the tools to provide that support. And we are working with you at the IDB in order to provide that one-stop shop, and also looking at the analysis to strengthen the diagnosis of sustainability factors to ensure sustainability at every level, at the environmental, social, economic, financial, fiscal level. All of this is vital for development. So here at the Vice Presidency, we will continue to support sustainable PPPs. And we believe that this is one of the fundamental ingredients here is also cooperation between the public-private sectors in order to bridge these gaps, and working with all institutions that play a relevant role in developing economic and social infrastructure in the region. So here at the IDB Group, we are very proud to continue in this cooperation of efforts. And I'm very pleased to see these skills that through coordinating efforts through our one-stop shop, we will be able to continue to provide efficient, sustainable, and innovative solutions that will respond to the enormous risks. Thank you very much.